To this webinar on Fratelli Tutti, hosted by the Australian Cardine Institute and Social Policy Connections. This webinar is a sequel to a webinar on Fratelli Tutti hosted by both organisations on 22nd of October 2020. It was a free-flowing and lengthy discussion with over 100 participants. This presentation will revisit the formal presentations on that day and distill the essentials of the discussions that followed. My name is Brian Lawrence. I'm the President of the Australian Cardine Institute. The Institute works to promote research, studies and training programs based on the vision and methods pioneered by Cardinal Joseph Cardine, the founder of the Young Christian Workers Movement. Social Policy Connections is an ecumenical social advocacy network based in Melbourne. Our guest speakers are from Social Policy Connections. Our first speaker, Father Bruce Duncan, is the Director of Social Policy Connections. For many years, he has taught the history, content and relevance of Catholic social thought at Yarra Theological Union in Melbourne. He is well known across Australia through his many publications on these subjects. Our second speaker, Danusia Kaska, is a board member of Social Policy Connections and is the Social Justice Network Coordinator at Xavier College in Melbourne. Stefan Gigas, the Secretary of the Australian Cardine Institute, is our webinar controller. I will now hand over to Stefan. Thank you, Stefan.
Thanks very much, Brian. Today we'll do this in a bit of a question and answer format, and I'll pose a few questions to Bruce along the way. But right now I'd like to hand over directly to Bruce to offer his presentation. Thanks very much, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Stefan and Brian, and for the opportunity to speak to you today, and welcome everybody to this webinar. It's a really important topic for it to get across. As we know, it's Pope Francis's second major social encyclical, following up his earlier one, 2015, on Laudato Si on environment, and entitled Fratelli Tutti on Fraternity and Social Friendship. A different emphasis that is coming through in this one. It's a partner to Laudato Si, but it doesn't take up the major issues of Laudato Si on climate change. It presumes he's already said enough on that, and we're all well aware of that, but what he is concerned about now is a new situation with coronavirus having a huge impact around the world and undermining the international economy with the risk of war. So that is his primary concern. And some of the commentators have been disappointed and upset that he's named it Fratelli Tutti because of the gender implications, particularly for the English-speaking world. I understand that in Spain and Italy, Fratelli is understood to be an inclusive term for men and women, but when you translate it into English, then it doesn't have that connotation. And this is disappointing that they could have easily entitled the document Fraternity and Social Friendship. But anyway, they've kept the words that St. Francis used in one of his talks to his brothers at the time, 800 years ago. But there's another aspect to this we must clear out of the way before we begin. It is that, and this is keenly disappointing from Pope Francis, that he hasn't used any references to women or referred to women scholars or saints who have contributed in this area or any of their writings. And this is so surprising because he's been so strong on women having a full voice in church and society, and yet it's omitted from this document. The only explanation I can think of is that it has been rushed out because he feared of the economic situation and the possibility of war. So I'd just like to acknowledge that this is, I'm surprised that none of his advisors said to him, look, we've got to just to include all the women writers that have contributed in this area, and the scholars and the great advocates in the past. There have been so many. But anyway, it is what it is. So that mustn't distract us, though, from the really substantial issues that this encyclical is dealing with. Because like in Laudato Si, he did not only address the climate issues, but he also addressed the issues of growing inequality in the world, and particularly the extremes of inequality. That wealth is so concentrated in a way we've never seen before, with people having hundreds of billions of dollars in wealth, and the top 1% having more wealth than half the entire rest of the world. You know, this is just astonishing figures. He doesn't go into the economics of this. He's talking to the moral aspects. So he's not using the sort of scientific and economic advice that he used in Laudato Si. And this is another difficulty with the encyclical, that it's very self-referential, that he uses 172 quotes that he's made of his own talks in various parts of the world in the last 7.5 years, going on 8 years. And the rest of the quotes that he uses, over 100 of them from church documents, previous popes, and some other scholars or notable individuals, but none of them men. So why is this? You know, it's very strange to keep quoting your own material like this. And I think the answer to that is, and one of the commentators said, is the Pope thinking of retiring? It reads like a last will and testament. And is he thinking that we're about to plunge into a big war, or is he ill, or is he going to retire? So it reads like that. It's very easy to read. It's very well expressed in very personable language, as Francis writes like that, but it's puzzling. And the way I look at it is like this. It's as if he's assembled all these little pieces of a mosaic, and they're all individual colors. And as you build a mosaic, you know, you build it up from little colored stones, and you glue them into place, and you develop another picture out of that. And I think that's the way to look at this encyclical, is it's a mosaic of his own reflections on where we are as a planet, and particularly what are the perils that are facing human well-being at this very moment. So
Bruce, many commentators were expecting Fratelli Tutti to expand on the concerns the Pope highlighted in Laudato Si about climate change and global warming. Yet actually in Fratelli Tutti, he says very little about those issues. How would you explain that?
Yes, well, it's very surprising, isn't it? Because when we heard that he was producing another document, we very much thought it would be in a similar vein and tackle the climate issues very strongly again, as he has done in many of his talks and meetings since. But he allows the climate issues to fall into the background in this document. And I think he particularly wants the concentration. Look, I think it's like this. If you're looking at your TV today, tomorrow, it's full of climate change material. There are reports coming through about the danger, the rising temperatures, and there's lots of really good information. Schools and universities have picked this up very, very quickly. But what they haven't picked up on is the degree of inequality in the world and what we need to do to confront this, and particularly the ideology of neoliberal economics, which assumes that the free market of itself will produce the best outcomes almost automatically. And all firms have to worry about, big businesses, is to get into the marketplace and maximize their profits, and particularly in more recent years, in the short term, emphasis on short term. But what has happened, of course, is there's been a great aggregation of wealth into the hands of the giant corporations, and the hands of a very small elite in various countries. The elite is spread more. We have billionaires in China now and right through different countries. It is not being spread evenly. So this is what he wants to talk about, how we manage the inequality in the context of this great pandemic that we're going through. And particularly there's a sense of frustration and disappointment in his writings because in Laudato Si he was strongly backing the UN Sustainable Development Goals with the promise of channeling world resources into lifting living standards everywhere in the 17 different goals, reducing inequality, eliminating hunger, providing opportunity, education, good health care on a universal scale. The first time in history, the most astonishing program on how to do this for the entire world population. But he sees that not just with the pandemic, it is accentuated what was already happening with the growing inequality, that the economic system as it has developed in more recent years is really keeping many more people poor. The other thing about this encyclical is he originally intended it to be an encyclical to the world religions about how human fraternity binds us all together and that all of us are made in God's divine image, and hence everybody, whatever their religion, even if they don't have any religion at all, they're completely atheist, they're still made in God's image, and we need to respect that. And as an indication, and he started writing the encyclical like that. Particularly, he was taking a document he had signed with the Grand Imam of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Sheikh Ahmad Al-Tayyeb in Abu Dhabi in February 2019, which is entitled The Document on Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together. This is one of the most astonishing documents of modern times and very strongly condemning terrorism in the name of God, and committing each other to recognize and reverence the religious traditions of Christians and Muslims together. Francis wanted to expand this into a more universal declaration among the great religions about committing them to human well-being and doing it peacefully. And just to quote from Fratelli, he says, quoting the document, "By acknowledging the dignity of each human person, we can contribute to the rebirth of a universal aspiration for fraternity between all men and women. Let us dream then as a single human family, as fellow travelers, sharing the same flesh, as children of the same earth, which is our common home, each of us bringing the riches of his or her beliefs and convictions, each of us with his own voice or her voice, brothers and sisters all." The word fraternity, some of the commentators said this is a gender issue again, using that word fraternity, but it comes out of the context of this dialogue between the Muslim and Christian Pope and the Imam. Fraternity for those two great religions is not seen in gender terms, but it is very deep in their traditions, as indeed it is in all the great world religions, and even in our secular traditions. You think of French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, it's all, but of course understood today in an inclusive framework. The encyclical begins with the Pope Francis referring to that document, and he refers to it throughout the document about 8 times, his own encyclical about 8 times, it keeps coming back to it. And he closes the encyclical in chapter 8 with a chapter called Religions at the Service of Fraternity. So again, he's incorporating this notion of religions as really putting all their moral support and energy behind this global effort to lift human well-being everywhere. And it says, it denounces violence and hateful attitudes in the name of religion as a terrible distortion. Quote, God the Almighty has no need to be defended by anyone and does not want his name to be used to terrorize people. So it's a remarkable document that he's appealing to here. And the encyclical ends with two little prayers, one that all believers in a creator can say together of all religions, and another shorter ones explicitly for Christians. So if I could summarize this, what he's doing in the encyclical, he's wanting all the world religions to speak together about how precious every single person is in God's sight, made in God's image, deserving of respect and honour, and that in God's eyes, we are all brothers and sisters, and we need to learn to dialogue and encounter each other, to learn this as an art, a skill, and to see how God leads us in many paths to seek the well-being of everyone, especially those in trouble or distress. And Francis is taking up now that French revolutionary cry, liberty, equality, fraternity. But everybody's talking about in the Western world liberty, that we can see that in the United States, we don't have to talk about that so much. But equality and fraternity, we do have to talk about. And they're going to be the themes of the encyclical.
Bruce, we can recognise the importance of this document on human fraternity signed by Pope Francis and the Grand Imam. But what would you say about what that means for the rest of the world?
I think what he is doing here is as a religious leader and with the backing of other world religions, calling for urgent action, world action at this very pivotal moment in history, in collaboration with all the great religious traditions, even with people who are not believers, but are committed to human and planetary well-being. He seeks out the common ground for this in simple compassion and simple humanity, and he locates it in Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan as expressing a moment of truth, he calls it, for all believers. And it is this: will we bend down to touch and heal the wounds of others? Are we going to be doing that? And it not only invites us to compassion and personal outreach, but I think it empowers us to bridge differences in search of a common solidarity for everyone. These are his words. He writes, "A journey of peace is possible between religions. Its point of departure must be God's way of seeing things. God does not see with his eyes. God sees with his heart. And God's love is the same for everyone, regardless of religion. Even if they are atheists, his love is the same. When the last day comes and there is sufficient light to see things as they really are, we're going to find ourselves quite surprised." And he was quoting there from the new film Francesco by Wim Wenders, out in 2018. And he had said, paradoxically, even those who claim to be unbelievers can sometimes put God's will into practice better than believers. Well, I think we're all seeing that too. So what Francis is doing is inviting people of all goodwill into a process of discernment about how to protect human well-being now and the planet, welfare of the planet at a critical time. So he's talking about a process of doing this, careful reflection on our own experience, evaluating that what's happening around us in the light of the moral values and belief we all hold, and particularly the Good Samaritan captures that. You don't have to be a believer to recognise the moral truth of that parable. And then the third step, determining action to take in response. He wants this to be a process the whole world is involved in. And of course we are involved in various ways, in much more sophisticated ways than he's going to put to us. He uses this method of what See, Judge, Act. Some of you will recognise that from the Young Christian Workers movements and other groups influenced by Canon Cardine from the 1920s. He developed it as a method for engaging the experience and reflection and participation of young workers, initially young women workers, but young male workers as well. And it's not just a method of discernment, but it's an empowerment method to give people the confidence and strength and skills to really take the action where in their factories or their workplaces or wherever their situation was. So this See, Judge, Act method is very evident. It underlines Pope Francis, all his main documents, he uses this method. And it's particularly, you'll see it in this document where it begins with the dark shadows of the world. Then he talks about the Good Samaritan, and a very insightful, not preachy, but really working out of his own experience too. I think you will enjoy reading that. And then going on to the 6 chapters about what are we going to do?
Yeah, Bruce, you mentioned Dark Clouds Over a Closed World, the title of his first chapter. Why is Pope Francis so concerned about current events that he drastically changed direction with the new encyclical?
Thank you. Why is he so concerned about current events? Because he can see that the chaos in many countries that is following from the coronavirus, and where you get chaos and the breakdown of resources, food, water, petrol, communications, then you get civil disorder, and you can get civil wars, and we're seeing that in various parts of the world, but also you can see great conflict between countries over resources and poverty. Most especially what he's concerned about is the great opportunity we have as a human race to eliminate hunger and poverty almost within our lifetimes, or at least the lifetimes of younger people today. And this is an astonishing moment that we can't let slip, but it is slipping. That is his concern. The astonishing gap between rich and poor, and particularly he blames in large part the power of global economic interests who are manipulating the system for their own interest and not for the common good. And you can see instances of this. This is in part why action on climate change is being so slow. It's been held up by coal and fossil fuel industries, even though everybody is clamouring for a really strong action. We see this in Australia. But internationally, also, it means disaggregating wealth and power so that everybody the power of special interest is broken. It doesn't mean chaos. We already have the institutions in the United Nations and other international organisations which can be improved. He says, of course, yes, they need improvement, but we do have the instruments to create a much better and a fairer world, and particularly one that's going to be more sustainable. So he's speaking out of a certain sense of frustration and desperation about the build-up of global tensions, and particularly the arms race is getting underway again. As we know, even in our part of the world, with tensions with China, over Taiwan, clashes here and there. What he must be really afraid of is if there is a full-scale war sparked in any number of places. Could happen. And he says at one point, major political crises result in the deaths of millions of children emaciated from poverty and hunger. And we see this in Syria, Yemen, other places and now increasingly in parts of Africa. So in a lament that captures his frustration and presumably referring to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, though he doesn't name them, he writes, "A plan that would set great goals for the development of our entire human family nowadays sounds like madness. The slow and demanding march towards an increasingly united and just world is suffering a new and dramatic setback. Yes, wealth has increased, but so has inequality, causing new forms of poverty." And Francis is afraid that growing anger, widespread anger about the unjust distribution of wealth, resulting in hunger, disease, environmental disasters, look at the environmental disasters happening, will result in increasing violence and disorder, the accelerated arms race, abuse of human rights, and this will tumble easily into a spreading war. He deplores the aggressive nationalism of various ideologies and the dominance of the economic and financial sector, linked with foreign interests and transnational economic powers, imposing a version of globalization, strengthening the powerful at the expense of the weak. He talks about these new forms of cultural colonization have bent words like democracy, freedom, justice, and utility to serve as tools for domination. And how curious now that the Pope is one of the major focus and voices in defence of democracy. He's dismayed at the degradation in politics, where hyperbole, extremism, and polarisation have become political tools, using slick marketing techniques to discredit others, and with debate degenerating into, quote, a permanent state of disagreement and confrontation. Other issues he picks up, and gladly you'll be here to, he speaks strongly about the situation of women in many societies that do not allow them the same dignity and rights as men. Quote, "Millions of people today, children, women, and men of all ages, are deprived of freedom and forced to live in conditions akin to slavery, sold and reduced to being the property of others. Women are subjugated and forced to abort. Others are kidnapped to sell their organs, and human trafficking is spread worldwide. These situations of violence, sad to say, have become so common as to constitute a real Third World War fought piecemeal. And he goes on, "When one part of society exploits all that the world has to offer, acting as if the poor did not exist, there will eventually be consequences. Sooner or later, ignoring the existence and rights of others will erupt in some form of violence, often when least expected. Liberty, equality, and fraternity can remain lofty ideals unless they apply to everyone." Now, some critics have criticised the Pope for what they called hysterical language. But he replies he's speaking as a voice for the exploited and discarded people, not for those living in opulence. And he blames a profit-based economic model that does not hesitate to exploit, discard, and these are his words, even kill human beings. So he is speaking very strongly, but he is speaking from the third world. And he's from the various poorest parts of the third world, parts that he's known and experienced in Argentina himself. He continues that the pandemic has forced us to recover our concern for human beings, for everyone, rather than for the few. We need to rethink our lifestyles and, above all, the meaning of our existence. He says the world is crying out in rebellion against our feverish consumerism. Excuse me, without an attempt to enter into this way of thinking. What I am saying here will sound wildly unrealistic, he says. We can rise to the challenge, let me rephrase it, we can rise to the challenge of envisaging a new humanity. We can aspire to a world that provides land, housing, and work for all. This is the path of peace, not the senseless and myopic tragedy or strategy of sowing fear and distrust in the face of outside threats. And he says that he appeals to all those who are working for social harmony. They, quote, should never forget that inequality and lack of integral human development make peace impossible.